Hi everyone, it's Amy here from Mrs. Amy 123, where I help Aussie teachers just like you conquer the Australian curriculum. In today's PD session, I'm going to be talking all about maths, how I plan for maths, what my approach is to maths, and some of the strategies I use to make my maths lessons as effective and engaging as possible. First of all, I want to take you through some different approaches to maths that I chose not to use because they didn't suit me in my classroom, and I want to share the reasons why I'm not using them within my classroom so you guys can make your informed decision as to whether you want to go with those approaches or not. So the first approach that I decided didn't really work for me was blocking off your maths content into 3 or more week blocks. So it might look like in term 1 spending 4 weeks on place value and then 4 weeks on measurement and then the next 4 weeks, which runs into the next term, on something else. To me, this doesn't work very well because you're only going to get in about 10 different topics a year. And most Australian curriculum maths content areas have about 25 outcomes. So that means you have to try and group them into 2 or 3 outcomes just to try and put them into 10 content blocks. And then that doesn't give opportunity to come back and really look at those areas again. So however far a student got in measurement in, let's say, in that term 1 cycle, they're not going to get an opportunity again to rehash that subject and maybe do better. And also those students who struggle with retention, maybe they understand it in term 1, but by term 4 it's gone out of their head. And for grade 1 students and grade 2 students, lower primary, they really need that constant reiteration of things and going over things again for it to really lock in their long-term memory. The other reason that clumping it into blocks just doesn't sound like me is because I would get bored of looking at a subject for that long. If I had to do measurement for 4 weeks, my head would explode. And if I'm getting bored, the chances are the students are going to get bored. So it's just not something that I would like to do in my classroom. Also, you have to question how good it is for your weaker and higher students. So sometimes students just aren't ready for a concept. Sometimes there's other knowledge that needs to slot in there first before they can understand what you're trying to teach them. So maybe you're looking at something in measurement, but something has to slot in place first in another area, in place value or in operations, before that one's going to make sense. Or maybe they just need a bit of time and they need to be older before that's going to make sense. So clustering it all into one block and trying to jam it into them may just never work. They may not get it until term 4, so you might be wasting your time. And your more able students, they're going to be getting bored more quickly, and the chances of them starting to misbehave because of boredom is going to become a problem. So they're the reasons why I chose not to go with that approach. The next approach is one that I see in a lot of maths programs that are out there commercially, and that's where you're chopping and changing content areas every single day or every second or third day. So you might start on Monday with a measurement lesson, and then on Tuesday you're doing place value. Maybe Wednesday there was a bit of continuity, you're doing place value again, but then by Friday you're doing operations, and it just flips and changes all around like that. This approach really doesn't work for me because my head doesn't like jumping around like that. If I'm just starting to get into place value and the techniques that we use for place value and the language, I don't want to be swapping around the next day and trying to get my head around something else. That's the same for resources too. If you have a math storage room like I do at my school and you're doing measurement one day and you've got to go and get all the measurement stuff out for your students to use, and then the next day you're doing a different subject and you've got to go get different stuff, it really doesn't work if you're sharing those resources between a bunch of classes, because you're going to have them in your class like all year, just ready for when that subject might dance and flip between the different ones. I think it's also harder to build deeper understanding with your students because you're not able to build on their knowledge. You're just going here and then there, and the students are trying to play catch up all the time. It can also be really, really hard to assess because, well, how can you assess something that you did 4 weeks ago and now all of a sudden you're doing it again, but you're only going to do it for one day and then tomorrow you're going to change? It's just not an approach that ever really worked for me and for my brain. The last approach, which is becoming really popular at the moment, and I wish it worked for me, but it doesn't, is where you are teaching in small groups. So maybe the rest of your students are rotating through activities and you're working with one group every 20 minutes, or maybe you're working with one group a day, but you're explicitly teaching them at their level and the other students are off playing numeracy games. In theory, this all sounds great and really targeted, but it doesn't work for me. First off, because of behavior management, trying to work with your group but controlling everybody else. It really did my head in when I used to do literacy groups, just trying to do it that way and concentrating on your group while other people are making noise, and also trying to keep all those other students engaged and like on track and working on what they're meant to be. A lot of maths games, if you're not really intentional about what you're doing and the thought processes behind it, you're not going to get anything out of it. So this approach just really didn't work for me and my teaching style, but it does have a lot of positives if it is something that you want to do with your students. So now let's get into the approach that I use and why I use it and how it works. So what I choose to do is a different topic every single week. So from Monday to Friday, I am teaching one topic and then the next week I change. But it has a flow to it and there's a reason that I change to each topic and why each topic is in a specific order. So maybe I'm starting with place value to give them a grounding in numbers, and then the next week I'm teaching operations and I'm using strategies to do with place value. Or I'm doing number lines, which I also did in the place value to order numbers, but now I'm using number lines to add on. So it just flows nicely, and I put a lot of thought into which lessons are necessary before each other to build up the content knowledge that students are going to need to be successful in the next area, while also practicing the content where they came from. So adding on with a number line is practicing the content that they worked on the week before when they were ordering numbers. So it's not disjointed like swapping around every single day. It's got a nice flow to it, but you are getting through the content areas, and within a term you're getting through almost the whole curriculum, and every single term you're revising and building on those different areas. So I do 6 maths lessons a week, and 5 of those are part of my normal maths program, and the other extra lesson is to do with problem solving and basic maths concepts, which I'll circle back around and talk about towards the end of this video. So I choose to use almost like the gradual release of responsibility that we often use in writing. I choose to use that in maths. So what I will do at the beginning of the week is start off at a very low level. So let's say I'm teaching a year 5 maths lesson. I'm probably going to start the lesson off at a year 3 or year 2 level. So what's the prior knowledge that you need to know here? What's the outcome that came the year or 2 before that you need to build on to get to where we're going with this outcome? So the first lesson is a bit of diagnostic in terms of you're gathering data on what your students already know, but it's also starting at a lower point so you can bring in all of those weaker students and start off with an area where they are going to experience some success. Then as the week progresses, you're slowly building on that to where you're getting more and more complicated with your concepts that you're teaching, and by the end of the week on the Friday I do a little mini assessment. The assessments are just meant to be quick. They're only meant to be like a 15-20 minute assessment, and then I do choose to go through those answers with my students so that it's a learning opportunity, not just an assessment. And then I keep that data for the next time that I'm going to be teaching that same topic. I know where the students were last at, so I know my starting point. But again, I will always start a little bit lower than where they finished that assessment, because as time goes on, there's different things that they're not going to retain. So I'm going to want to get that knowledge reviewed before I keep continuing to build the content. Within each of my lessons, I follow a structure of the first 10 to 15 minutes is mental maths, and I do have another PD session on mental maths and some of the different things that I use, like number of the day and my different sorting strips, and I will leave a link to that down below or up above, wherever you're watching this video. There will be a link to go and watch that if you're interested. That's great because it refreshes their knowledge on everything. So if you're doing number of the day or you're doing my mental sorting strips, they cover a very wide amount of knowledge from the maths curriculum areas. So the students are always getting started by reviewing everything. So their brains are not only getting engaged because they like the activity, but they're also getting switched on and ready for maths talk. Then I start my lessons off with some explicit teaching, usually going through things on the board, usually trying to engage the students as much as I can, whether it's using student pickers to pick students out to give me answers to questions I might ask, or inviting students up to the board to show me how they have worked out problems or used different strategies. Sometimes I'll put examples up on the board and give students a little bit of time to solve them before different students come up and model the strategies that they use to solve them. And then I'll move on to different activities during the lesson. Sometimes they're worksheets, but not always. I think worksheets have a place in maths, but they are not the be and end all. So other strategies that I like to use are things like write the room, so where the problems are up around the room and the students actively move around to record their answers to different problems, because that's going to get those kids who like the body kinesthetics to move around and be active in their learning. I also like to do lots of cooperative strategies, so where students are getting together and maybe solving a problem together or sharing how they solved a problem with each other. I like to do sorts, matching things up, sorting them into groups, categorizing them, trying to do a lot of hands-on learning as much as possible, getting out manipulatives to play games. But when we do play games, the whole class is on the same type of game, but maybe with some differentiation thrown in. So if we're doing a dice game, some of the weaker kids might be just using one dice, whereas the more able students might be using two dices to make it harder and more challenging for them at their level. But it is not always a worksheet. I really try hard to only have like 2 or 3 worksheets a week maximum. As I said before, in my introductions to the maths lesson, I love using students as teachers to come up and show us how they got their answers, and I will use that strategy multiple times throughout a mathematics lesson, because I think it's really important for students to learn a range of strategies and also to hear those explanations from a range of different people, because we all explain things differently. So when I'm explaining things, I will often try a different approach each day. So one day I might use an analogy of place value being like cakes and baking a cake, but the next day I might not use that same analogy. I might change it to something else, because it's going to engage different students and different things are going to click in their head. So if you have a lot of students who aren't understanding something that you've been teaching and teaching and teaching again, trying to come at it from a different angle and a different explanation and using different words or a different model can really help those students to click in. And sometimes if you're not able to do that, bringing up student teachers who can show how they did it to explain their logic behind it, that can help somebody else in the classroom click. I always like to encourage different strategies in my class, and I will teach a range of strategies. So when we're doing adding, I will teach number lines, and I will teach an algorithm, and I will teach using manipulatives, and I will teach using the build to 10 strategies and trading and all of that sort of stuff. I will teach all the different strategies, not just one, because you don't know which strategy the students are going to connect to. And what I like to say to my students a lot is that there is no right or wrong strategy for solving a problem, but there is better ones. So you don't want to always be using manipulatives, because manipulatives are slow. So we need to move you to a better strategy that's going to get you the answer faster. But then there's always a choice of strategies, and not getting locked into one strategy. So you don't want the student to become confident in just algorithm, because then they're going to use an algorithm all the time, and they might get a question like 99 plus 18 and they're there trying to do the algorithm and carry over, when the build to 10 strategy would have been so much better. Just take one from one side, swap it to the other. 117, so much quicker to do 100 plus 17 than it was to do 19 plus 18 as an algorithm. So expose your students to a wide range of strategies for everything that you do, and allow them to experiment with those different strategies and work out which ones make sense to them and which ones are better. Within my lessons each week with the students, I'm always trying to have at least one lesson that's very independent for the students to do, so that you do have time to pull out those students who are struggling with a concept and spend some more explicit time with them, using manipulatives, showing them another way of doing it. Sometimes some students just need one-on-one time to understand a concept. They need to be there asking you frequent questions every step of the way to actually be able to understand it in their head. So if you have an activity where the students are all working independently and you can pull students out to work with them, then that's a really, really great use of your time and a really great way to structure your lessons. So that's my kind of approach to mathematics lessons in an overview, swapping out the content every single week, but having a flow to it and a reason for doing it in the order that it is, constantly building up on the students' knowledge, so taking it from a lower level and then building it up, even to a point where sometimes on the Friday lesson, I'm teaching the content from the year above to show them where the next step is and to challenge those students who are ready for it to start taking the next step. And also, I truly believe that the more times that you hear something, the more likely you are to retain it. So say in a year 5 class, if I'm starting to teach them year 6 stuff, by the time that they get to year 6, those things are going to click in place quicker, because they've already had some groundwork for it the year before. I think think some of the benefits to this maths approach is that, as I said in the beginning of this video, sometimes students just need more time. So by teaching it once in term 1 and then again in term 2, maybe they weren't ready for it in term 1, but in term 2 it starts to click because they have that other information there that they needed, or they needed to be a little bit older before it clicked. I think it gives students more chances of success because you're constantly revising, you're constantly giving them more chances to do it, and constantly revising all of those strategies that they need to employ for the different maths concepts. And I think it's also great when you go to do your reports at the end of semester 1 and semester 2, because your work samples for those areas that you're reporting on are going to be more recent. It's also great if you're doing any whole school tests, because often whole school tests are going to test a wide range of maths. So because I do have my term planners and my year is more or less planned out, and I have what I'm going to be teaching in maths lined out for each week, a lot of people ask me, well, how do you cater for every class? Because every class is unique, every class has different abilities in maths, and they're going to be at different places. So how can you do the same concepts every year no matter what group you have? And there's a couple of answers to that. Number one, different classes aren't actually that different. When you average them out, they all end up being around the same kind of area anyway. Second, because I start my maths week at a lower level and then build up, it's like scooping up those students that are at the bottom and hopefully lifting them up higher than they started, and lifting them and catching each level as you rise up. So you're catching those students at the different level and hopefully bringing most of them to an average point and not leaving too many at the bottom. Another thing that I do is I do my maths test. So you guys know that I have an initial version of this that teaches the outcomes from the previous year. And I usually do my maths test within somewhere between day 3 and day 6 of being with the students. And I go through and mark it, and then I put the results of these maths tests onto an Excel spreadsheet where I can see where the students are at. Now, because this is assessing the previous year level, you would expect to see a lot of green, a lot of students having achieved the outcomes from the previous year. More or less, you usually get about 75%, but not always. Sometimes you do get a lot of red. Sometimes it's the summer slide having caused it, and the students just need to revise those. And you can check that by seeing how close the scores are. If most of the scores are pretty close to being C's and they just didn't get it, then that's just the summer slide, and scooping them up is going to cover them. However, if you have a lot of red, maybe it's just that teacher didn't cover it. And so when you come to teaching your year level version of that outcome, so the next step in that outcome, you will just start at a slightly lower place, or you'll give more scaffolding, more modeling, more help to the students with those outcomes. Seldom do you have to change up your whole lesson approach if your lesson is allowing students to work at their own level and catering for a wide range of students in the first place. So then I do another one of my tests right before my reports are due in term 2, so around week 5 is usually when I do it. And because it's the middle of the year and I will have taught all of the outcomes by that point, I'm expecting most of my students, most of my C-level students, to have a lot of these areas ticked off, but I am definitely not expecting them to have all of them ticked off. By the middle of term 2, you would expect that a lot of the content has dropped into place and they know it for their year level, but there's still a couple of areas where you're going to have to do more work with them, and that's fine. So I look for about 50% of these outcomes to be ticked for the student to achieve a C, and all of them to be ticked basically to achieve a B, because then that means that they're progressing towards really having a deep understanding of this content, so they're probably going to be a B. And basically topping out of the test if they're an A by the middle of the year. I then insert all of this into the Excel spreadsheet, and then I'm looking for areas where there is a lot of red. So if 75% of the class hasn't achieved one of these outcomes, then I'm going to prioritize that outcome. And maybe I have an area that's all green. So maybe they did really, really well. Let's say it's a year 5 test. They did really, really well in financial planning. They all got green, they've all achieved it. Well, maybe I don't need to repeat that in term 3, but maybe they did terrible on something to do with decimals. So maybe I just take that, money unit out and do an extra week on decimals. You can still swap and change a term planner around. It's not a lock-in contract where you have to go, yes, I have to do this in this week. If your data is showing that your students need something different, then you can definitely swap things around and do what you need to do and do extra weeks of things. Or you might look at the term 3 planner and go, well, I'm doing decimals in week 2 of term 3 anyway, so yes, they didn't do very well on it in the test, but I'm going to rehash it again, and when I get there, I'm just going to make sure that I do a better job of teaching it, or I'm going to do more manipulatives and hands-on things to get that concept across, or I know that I'm going to have to assist students more to get through that week and to help them more. Maybe it's that you're going to bring in some helpers to help you with that area. You're looking at it and figuring out, well, what can you do to help your students in that area where they're struggling. If on the test there are students who are struggling in certain areas, but it's not going to be a whole class focus, again, look at your term planner and ask yourself, are you going to be looking at it again? And maybe when you get to that week, you just pay special attention to that student and you look for times when you can go over to that student and help them one-on-one, when you can model it with the student. Or maybe you're pairing them up with a student who did quite well in that area and having them mentor that student and really help them. Then by the time I reach the end of the year and I do the final test, the last few weeks of school are revision for my kids. I just make sure I focus on those areas where the students didn't do well in here. So if it came out that the students really didn't do very well in patterns and algebra, then a lot of my Christmas maths activities are going to be based on patterns and algebra. So there is always an opportunity to revise work. The term planners are not in a lock-in contract. So these tests are really, really great. They're so informative. They're the only big maths tests that I do each year, and like I said, there's just 3 of them, the initial, middle and final, that I do in number and algebra. And then I usually only do 1 measurement and geometry full test and 1 statistics and probability full test. And then let's say if I did the full measurement and geometry test in term 2 and the students really didn't do well on one of the areas, let's say it was on 3D shapes, then in semester 2 I might not give them the whole test again. I might just give them the page on 2D shapes and see how they're progressing with that. And these tests are really, really handy when it comes to reporting time, because you've got the outcomes here and you can literally see what score the students got in it. It's really easy to write your report comments. So if it says here, recognize, model, represent and order numbers to at least tens of thousands, and the student can do that, that's your comment right there. Rebecca can recognize, model, represent and order numbers to at least tens of thousands. It can just be that easy. Or here, the student recall multiplication facts. It says they can do 2, 5, 10 and 3s only. Well, that's your report comment. Melissa can recall multiplication facts for 2, 5s, 10s and 3s. She would benefit from more work on multiplication facts up to 10 times 10. Using this to write your report comments is just so quick and easy, because it's just 1 page that you have to look at and just about your whole report comment is done. So I mentioned before that I teach maths 6 times a week. It is a requirement here in WA that we spend half of our teaching time teaching maths and literacy, which means you end up with about 6 or 7 lessons needing to be dedicated to maths. So 5 of those lessons I work on that content area that is listed in my term planners, and then for the other lesson I do a mixture of problem solving and basic maths. So for the problem solving, what I like to do is approach 1 strategy at a time. So starting off with logic and reasoning, then go into act it out, then draw a picture or a diagram, and going through all of the other strategies. I start the lesson off by introducing the strategy and giving some kind of examples or showing some ways of using that strategy, and then I let my students go through some example questions. So I present the question up on the board, we talk about what the problem is asking, we talk about what we know about the problem and what we don't know, and then I give students time to solve it. When about 75% of the class has solved the problem, depending on what the problem is, once most students have gotten it, we will stop the whole class and I'll have students come up and they will explain how they got the answer, and we'll check it with the rest of the room as to whether that was right. And I will always ask, is there anybody else that got it a different way? Once we've gone through the question, we'll go on to the next question. And I usually do that for about 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the strategy that we're doing. Sometimes it only lends itself to 1 week. So for something like find a pattern, where you're probably also teaching finding like number patterns as an actual content area, you probably only need to spend 1 week on it. And then the following week we will do a worksheet on it, where students go off, they work on a worksheet independently, and when they finish that worksheet they bring it up to me, I mark it. If there's any questions they got wrong, they go back and try again, and then at the end of that lesson I will stop the whole class and again use student teachers to tell us what the answers are and how they got it and which strategy they used. Working through all of the different strategies usually takes me about 27 weeks, and then for the remainder of the weeks for the rest of the year, I give them problems that aren't designated with a strategy. So here's a problem, you need to go off and pick a strategy for it. And I also really like using some open-ended problem-solving ones, some problem-solving questions where there are multiple answers that students can get, because they're really, really good for the extension kids, because, you know, they've got to keep finding new answers. In the second half of that lesson, so usually that lesson goes for about 30 to 40 minutes, depending on how the students are doing, because I do problem solving in the afternoon. So by the afternoon, their brains are starting to flatten out a little bit. They need to be recharged. So I don't do problem solving for as long as I would my maths lessons during the middle of the day. So after that, I do basic maths facts. So to do this, I do just different games. Each week is a different game. The whole class plays the same game, but again, differentiating it. So sometimes it might just be a simple addition game, like roll 2 dice, add the sum, and you're competing against your partner to see who can say the answer first, and you're giving yourself a point, and then swap partners. And so the more able students in that case are going to be using your 3 dice and adding 3-digit plus 3-digit numbers together. A great source of games is Paul Swan. If you want to check him out, he is from WA. He has a whole heap of games, whole heap of books that you can check out. A lot of online free downloadable stuff. So he is a great source of games if you want to do that. But I found that practicing basic facts was really important for my students to have that quick recall and the basic knowledge to then apply to other math content areas that we did. So when we're looking at doing area, students aren't getting bogged down by the fact that they don't know their timetables easily enough. So I have been asked for a long time now to create maths programs because people love my text types and my HATs and my technologies units, and they really wanted to see something maths-wise out of me. And I am so happy to announce that I finally have some maths programs out, and I have a couple of exciting things to announce in this video, so keep watching, you're not going to want to miss this. Basically what I did for my maths programs was I followed my term planners. So if you haven't got your hands on my term planners yet, they are free when you sign up to my email list, and they lay out the curriculum with exactly what you can teach each week. And again, it's in an order that really flows nicely. I put a lot of time and thought into which areas should come first and how often you should be teaching each curriculum area, because obviously maths is huge and you only have a limited time. So a lot of thought was put into those. So I've been working hard to try and get these maths programs out for you guys, and at the time of filming this video, I have every single week done for term 1 and term 2 for years 1 to 6, and I have finally bundled those together for you guys, and they are available on my website as we speak. I've got a couple of exciting things to tell you about, in addition to the fact that the ultimate bundles are up for maths. So if you purchase the maths bundle now, not only will you get the entire semester's 1 maths programs, but you will also get the entire semester 2's maths programs, and barring any life events, hopefully that should happen before you need to teach each of those maths programs in semester 2. So can you imagine with just a couple of clicks getting your entire maths programming for the year done? Oh my gosh, that sounds amazing even to me, and I'm the one writing these programs. So before I created my maths programs, the way that I used to plan for maths is each week I would sit down, I would look at my term planner to see what concept I was teaching that week, and then I would, if I had already taught that concept, I would look at the assessments that I had done to see where my students were up to with that concept area, and then I would look at the outcomes if I needed to understand exactly what it was that I needed to teach within that concept. And then I would start looking at activities. And again, I would start the week off with easier content and then build up to harder content. Now that I am doing my maths programs though, I decided that I wanted to put it in the same template as I do for all of my other units, because I wanted to make sure that you could see the outcomes. I wanted to make sure that I was bringing in as many cooperative learning strategies as I could, and I just thought the layout would lend itself really, really well to you guys being able to understand what each maths lesson was about. So in the planner, you do start off with the lesson number down one side, then you have the focus of the lesson. So what is the main thing that the students are doing during that lesson or are going to get out of that lesson, and they can easily be able to be turned into wilts and waltz and things like that. Then you've got the learning experience, and again, these are kept very short and brief because I don't want you to have to spend forever prepping for a maths lesson where you have to read through this big long spiel or having this big humongous script telling you exactly what to say and undermining your own teaching ability, when I know that you guys are effective teachers and you can read something and then know how to deliver that and make it work for your students. So they are kept nice and succinct, and there is room to move within these maths programs. So if you know your students are slightly weaker, then you can bring it back a level. If you know your students need more modeling and explicit instruction, you can add that in. If the worksheets seem like they're too hard for that time when you're working with your students, maybe it's that you're going through them with the students and modeling each of them, or maybe you're giving your students the worksheet to do in groups. There is still a lot of flexibility. Don't feel like it's so scripted that you have to run it exactly as it's written. Use your teacher judgment, your knowledge of the students, to change it up to best suit your students. The next column is all the resources that you need, and obviously I've included just about every resource I possibly could for you to use with these, barring manipulatives. So you've got all your worksheets, you've got all your posters, you've got all your PowerPoints, anything that you need to teach this unit other than manipulatives is included in these programs. And then in the last column you have your assessment, and just like with any other of my planners, those assessments can be sometimes something that you take and you put into a checklist and you store away in your assessment logs. Sometimes it's just an observation of the group as to whether your lesson was effective or not. Then down the bottom of these maths programs, I have also included some ideas if your students need extra practice. So let's say you're getting to the end of the week and you know that a couple of students are just not getting it. These are activities that you can do with your students during little bits of time, or if you have access to an EA, these are activities that you could give to them. I've tried to make it a range of activities where possible, so sometimes it is individual, sometimes it's group activities, but it's just something that's easy at your fingertips for the students to be able to use. In my maths programs, I have also included an idea of a mental maths activity that you might like to run with them, but these are not included in the maths programs. So I hope you guys have enjoyed this little PD session today. I hope it's given you some food for thought about what you can do in your own maths lessons. And if you're interested in those ultimate maths programs, don't forget to go and check them out. I'll see you guys later. Bye!